I was bleeding in an ambulance, and my phone buzzed with a family group chat. The metal of the stretcher trembled underneath me as the EMTs worked. The siren made my temples thrum like a slow drum. I remember the smell, antiseptic and hot car leather, and the way my hands kept slipping from my twins' small, soft fingers as my sister's voice receded in the rear view. I remember thinking, we have 45 minutes before our sitter's shift ends, or the twins are completely on their own. I dialed my parents. I called and called, picturing my 3-year-olds Lily and Lucas at home in their pajamas, a tower of blocks halfway knocked over, a half-finished puzzle on the coffee table, the door unlocked for the sitter who was supposed to stay until midnight. I imagined their little bodies curled in a sleep that might be easy to rouse or impossible to wake. My dad didn't answer. My mom didn't answer. Instead, while the EMT slid the gurney into the ambulance, my cousin texted, "Everyone's in the group." I saw the group chat light up. Helen, Richard, Vanessa, Aunt Eleanor, Grandpa Thomas, a scattering of cousins. Then one message that made everything tilt. They called me a nuisance and a burden. There it was, plain on my screen. No hesitation, no apology. A phrase that made my chest go hollow in a way the pain hadn't yet managed. In the middle of sirens and confusion, those 5 words hit like their own small, precise wreck. I stayed quiet while the paramedic asked me my name. I mouthed it. I tried to breathe slow. Someone clipped a cuff around my arm to take a reading. The next thing I remember is Marcos, the ER doctor who had once guided me through a night shift when I'd nearly fainted, kneeling at the ambulance door, pulling off his jacket and saying, "Myra, hold on. Don't talk on your phone now. Let us secure you." He saw the screen. He read the message over my shoulder. He didn't say much. He just put his hand on my forehead and told the EMT to move faster. Later, as I lay under fluorescent lights and the beeping of machines, the surgery team moving with the quiet choreography of people who do this every day, the message sat at the back of everything. Between the quick, efficient voices, between the blood tests and the pressure bandaging, between the question of consent for surgery and the soft, shocked voice that asked if I had any kids at home, that phrase was there, raw, like a bruise. We found out quickly that my spleen had ruptured. I was losing blood internally. They intubated me, put me under, and I woke up 5 days later in a hospital room with both twins, under the care of a sitter arranged through an emergency agency I'd had on speed dial for situations like this. Someone, Aunt Eleanor, who had texted right away, sat with me for a few hours that first night, once I could hold a cup of water without feeling faint. Marcus came by during rounds to check on me, a steady presence whose hand on my shoulder felt like a tether to the world. It would have been obscene to expect anything less than medical competence from the hospital. The doctors saved me. The nurses held my hand when I cried without wanting to explain why I was crying. But the sting of the group chat, of being named a nuisance and a burden by my own mother and father, while my life literally hung in the balance, kept crawling back under my skin. In the slow, hazy days after surgery, when I had time to think between doses of pain medication and the cautious footsteps in the hallway, I started to look at my life like an accountant looking at a ledger. Not the medical ledger, my financial one. For 8 years since I started residency after med school, I had been quietly wiring money to my parents' account on the 1st of every month. It was automatic, bi-weekly at first when money was scarcer, then monthly as my salary climbed through fellowships and my night differentials. I told myself it was family duty. I told myself it was what you did for the people who raised you when their medical bills got expensive or when the roof needed a patch. I told myself things until the words meant nothing. The reality was simpler and harder. The transfers were a pattern. They began the year I graduated, small at first, a few $100s here and there for groceries after my father lost a contract. Then, as my role changed and my wages improved, I increased them to a steady schedule, automatic deposits that I didn't have to think about, that disappeared from my account like a ghost. I never once had the conversations other people seem to have. No thank you notes for taking care of the utilities. No we appreciate you. No real acknowledgement beyond an occasional Facebook birthday comment. When Lily and Lucas were born, the transfers didn't stop. If anything, they became more frequent. I thought, perhaps selfishly, that by smoothing their expenses, I could make space to focus on my kids. I could bring fewer casseroles, be present at more pediatric appointments, and when residency demanded nights, I could at least know the household that had once supported me was stable. Months turned into years. Small sacrifices compounded into a sea of quiet giving. It's astonishing when you add it up, how invisible labor and consistent money can be. The spreadsheet Aunt Eleanor later sent to me, she'd taken to keeping receipts because she could see something in my eyes I was denying, listed the transfers clearly. There were nearly 100 separate entries spanning 8 years. The numbers, when you let them together, stop being a series of charitable gestures and start to resemble a mortgage, about $360,000 total. Saying it aloud now, I can still hear the tilt in my own voice when I told Aunt Eleanor that number. At the time, in the aftermath of the surgery and the group chat, the number landed like a confirmation of something I'd felt but could not name. I had been buying my family's stability for almost a decade, and I had done it while they treated me as an annoyance. Even before the ambulance, there were signs that my presence, or my absence, entered the family ledger in strange ways. At my sister Vanessa's high points, the family celebrated like a chorus. She is a dazzling presence. Front row in New York at fashion weeks, a name whispered in tiny creative circles. At her graduation, there was a photo of our parents grinning under a banner, arms slung around the golden child. When my twins were born, the congratulations were polite. There were gifts, briefly, then the usual orbit. My parents would come to visits when it worked for them, not always rearranging their lives for my hospital processes or my night calls. They had always hung on to Vanessa as if she were proof of something they could not quite claim otherwise, and I, the dependable one, patched the household holes without asking for more than a little recognition. I don't tell you this to make you hate them. I tell you this because boundaries are not dramatic. They are accumulative. One late night at the stove, one check sent through the bank, one "don't worry about me," and then another. You tell yourself the next time will be different. Then there is no element of surprise anymore, only the steady hum of expectations and the exhaustion of being the only person responding. So when that message came through in the ambulance, it was not only wounding in the moment, it was the culmination. It was a sentence that captured an 8-year story in 5 words. After the surgery, while I was still fragile and needed help with the simplest tasks, I made a decision that surprised even me. It felt like stepping off a curb into cold water. I went home after those 5 days, and with Aunt Eleanor on the phone, pulled up my bank app. The automatic transfers had been set up years ago, some through my checking account, some through my payroll deductions. Once you set a machine in motion, it keeps going until you stop it. I stopped it. I called and canceled the recurring payments. I closed accounts that made the transfers easier. I blocked my parents' numbers from quick access on my phone, not out of spite, but more as a buffer. The day-to-day relief was immediate and complicated. There was a strange lightness and also a deep, aching guilt, like a parent who finally refuses to do sugar for their child's teeth, but who knows the tantrum is coming. I remember Marcus telling me softly that setting a boundary was not the same as burning a bridge. He had seen families in stress before and had sat with me through the initial shock in the ER, but the way he said it, "You are allowed to prioritize your health and your children," felt like permission more than advice. Aunt Eleanor became my anchor through those weeks. She brought casseroles, actual casseroles labeled and sensible, and sat with me while the twins played underfoot. She brought the folder. That folder was the thing that made the quiet war tangible. She handed it to me on her second Sunday visit, tucking it into my lap like a secret. Inside were printed bank statements, screenshots, copies of the transfer confirmations, an itemized calendar. Each page felt like a heavy stone. I flipped through them with trembling fingers. The entries marched across the months and years, transfer, 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 each annotated with dates and amounts, sometimes with little notes Aunt Eleanor had scribbled about what she thought each payment had covered. She hadn't meant to compile a dossier at first. She had noticed patterns. She had watched me flinch when my sister's name came up at the table, had seen me pay for their groceries when we were all together, and been told to sit down like it was nothing. She'd written little things on the margins at first. Is this still needed? Then as the pattern became clearer, the notes grew more forthright. Listen, she said that day, folding her hands around a mug of tea, heat tracing the lines at her knuckles. You did this because you loved them. That's not an argument. But you also did it at the cost of your own security. Grandpa should see this. Grandpa Thomas was more exacting than any of us. He'd been a federal judge for more than 30 years before he retired, sharp as a tack even in jokes, with a particular style of knitted cardigan that made his presence bookish and formidable at once. He was not the kind of person who ever liked drama. He liked facts. That's why Aunt Eleanor asked him to look at the folder before doing anything else. If anyone in the family could take the emotional weight out of what had happened and make a cleaner case for change, it was him. When I first told him the story, no debates, only the truth of the ambulance, the surgery, the message, he closed his eyes for a moment, like a judge taking the gravity of a case. Then he leaned forward and said he wanted the records. He wanted to see everything. He wanted to understand the pattern. I'm not one for theatrics, he told me, but people tend to listen to things when they're laid out plainly. If your parents do not understand what their behavior has done, maybe hearing it from someone else will help. I remember thinking then how strange it was to welcome the involvement of the person who had for years seemed like the final arbiter of family affairs. Grandpa Thomas took the folder home that afternoon. He called me 2 nights later and asked for more details, dates, bank account descriptions, any receipts for the bills I had intended to help cover. He said he wanted to check for errors. I felt both grateful and nervous, like handing a match to someone who'd been living alone in a house with dry curtains for too long. Over the next few weeks, while my twins acclimated to the new rhythm of our home, in a modest apartment a little closer to the hospital, Grandpa Thomas quietly did what he did best. He organized facts. He printed things out, made neat lists, cross-referenced transfers with mortgage statements and utility bills. He was methodical in a way that comforted me. There was a rational mind at work, turning the mess into a sequence of comprehensible events. As he worked, my parents' reaction was a mix of confusion and defensiveness. There were messages from Helen and Richard, short, then longer, then defensive. Vanessa texted in capital letters. I kept my distance. After being told you are a nuisance and a burden by the people who raised you, there's a strange survival instinct that whispers, do not engage until you can see clearly. That is when some relatives started to shift. Not everyone, and not immediately. But cousins who'd once made small slips about how Myra keeps things together began to offer practical help. Aunt Eleanor was a constant, showing up with spare diapers and clean sheets, and more importantly, companionship. Marcus picked up shifts that let me sleep more. Grandpa Thomas, quietly and with his inexorable calm, began asking to see the group chat in full. I told him everything I could remember. The friends who'd been present that night, the names in the group, the way the messages flowed. He asked for the exact text and for permission to show it to others if he thought it necessary. It felt at first intrusive, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that evidence was not a weapon if used for truth. It was a way to stop the gaslight cycle that had kept me apologizing for my own needs for years. There were small consequential moments in those days that felt like signposts. At a family barbecue, My parents laughed loudly at Vanessa's jokes and seemed oblivious when I excused myself for a quiet nap with the twins. At a pediatric appointment, the nurse commented that Lily had a new sleep pattern and asked if I had help during the nights. When I mentioned the emergency sitter option I'd had to use once, the nurse looked relieved that I had it. Unaware of the context behind why the sitter had to come at all, one evening Aunt Eleanor rang me and said, "Thomas thinks we should do something at his birthday." I pictured a small cake, some folding chairs, a few relatives clinging to tradition. The idea seemed odd at first. Why bring family tensions to an event meant to be gentle and celebratory? But then she explained. Grandpa's 70th was coming up, and he thought it might be the one time when enough of the family would be gathered in one place to have an honest conversation. He wanted to present the facts. He wanted, if possible, to open the hard conversation in a setting where people could not walk away mid-sentence. My throat tightened at the thought. The idea of standing in front of everyone and letting these years of quiet giving be visible felt both terrifying and right. I thought of Lily and Lucas coloring under the table with crayons, oblivious to familial currents, and I thought of the chunk of my life I had given away, as if it were my duty rather than a choice I had the right to reconsider. Right then, with the twins asleep and the apartment dim, I put my hand on my chest where the scar from the surgery was a pale line. It felt like a watershed moment. How much I had let slide by, how long I had conflated keeping peace with giving myself away. My body had named that cost for me in the most literal way. Saying no felt like admitting that the years had not always been kind. It felt like taking my name back. Before any of the conversations at Grandpa's birthday could happen, there was one more thing I needed to do, to ask myself what I was asking of them. Was I only looking for restitution, for acknowledgement, for an apology that would make the ache go away? I didn't have neat answers. I only knew that I could not go on as if the past 8 years had been perfectly normal. Aunt Eleanor encouraged me to consider what I would do with the money I had been sending. Once I stopped the automatic deposits, there was an immediate practical reorientation that was as mundane as it was freeing. I set up a college fund for Lily and Lucas. I arranged for a small emergency fund that would mean I wouldn't have to call strangers in the middle of a night again. I chose, in tiny, deliberate ways, to redirect the resources I had been using to underwrite the family home into building something for my children. There's a strange kind of quiet pride in doing practical things after trauma. You are not cured by a savings account, obviously, but there is agency. When you move money away from old obligations and toward the future, you are doing more than balancing a ledger. You are naming your priorities out loud. As all of this was happening, I kept thinking of the group chat message and how small things can reveal the architecture of a family. Words, once spoken, have gravity. They either sag under their own weight or they lift you, depending on who said them and why. For years, I had been the stabilizer, the person who quietly absorbed inconveniences for the sake of maintaining something that now, when measured, looked less like mutual care and more like unilateral sacrifice. Grandpa Thomas came to the apartment one weekday evening with an envelope, neat, businesslike, and sat across from me at my modest kitchen table. He spoke plainly. He had gone through the records with the patience of a man who had read more briefs than novels. He had printed a spreadsheet and had the bank statements collated in chronological order. "This," he said, tapping the top of the stack, "is the story as it appears on paper." He told me he would like to invite me to his 70th birthday. He did not say exactly what he would do there, only that he thought it was time for truth to be presented, plainly and in front of the family. I felt my stomach flip in a way that was almost relief, the kind that comes just before a plunge. A week later, after sheets and lists, after picking up a pair of tiny rain boots for Lucas when he outgrew his, Aunt Eleanor texted, "If this resonates with you, type truth in the comments." She was cheeky in ways that made the room lighter when she was around. I smiled at the message, and maybe because the idea of people sharing their own hard lines felt necessary, typed the word into my own notes app and then deleted it. There is no smallness to the decision to ask for help or to stop giving. It feels enormous. It feels like the first time you tell someone something true and watch whether they stay. For me, the staying came from unexpected places. Marcos worked extra shifts so I could sleep. Aunt Eleanor sat with me for dull afternoons. Cousins who had been distant came forward with offers to babysit that were, for once, not transactional. The preparation for the birthday was quiet and strategic. Grandpa Thomas called several relatives and invited them personally. He mentioned nothing of the folder on the call. Instead, he asked for family stories and requested that people come early. The invitation list included most of the immediate family and a few extended relatives whose presence would matter in terms of communal pressure. I found myself rehearsing nothing and everything, the ways I would answer questions, how I would keep the twins near, what I would say if an apology came too late or failed to come at all. Mostly I concentrated on small practicalities. A babysitter who could stay during the party, the twins' juice cups labeled, my own voice steady if the moment required me to speak. Before the event, there was one conversation that took me by surprise. Vanessa, my sister, messaged me, candor thin at the edges. She said she was sorry for the way things had unfolded that night of the accident. She wrote that she had not known how the transfers had been set up. She said she loved the kids and wanted to be there for them. Her words were not full apology. They were a cautious bridge. I read them aloud to Aunt Eleanor in the kitchen, and we both shrugged in that way families do when handed the raw edges of a slowly changing dynamic. A week later, the house needed to be put in order for the party. I sat on my couch, twins asleep on my chest, and looked at the folder Grandpa had left with me to review one last time. The bank statements looked like a barcode of years. The group chat message was printed out and tucked inside the folder, a nuisance and a burden. The phrase no longer fluttering on a phone screen, but settled on paper, undeniable. When you compile facts, sometimes the facts themselves do the work of truth-telling. They don't ruin people. They clarify choices that were made. They lay out what could be solutions, what were enabling patterns, and where boundaries were never enforced. In the small hours before the birthday, when I packed Lily's favorite stuffed rabbit and Lucas's dinosaur, when I told Marcus I might need backup if things went sideways, I felt a tremor of something odd and rare, hope that clarity could lead to change. Not the childish hope of instant transformation, but the practical hope that when someone is presented with the full answer, with numbers and dates, and the precise words that were used in the moments that mattered, they will have the chance to see themselves differently. Grandpa Thomas's 70th was set for a Saturday. The house would be crowded, loud, full of potluck dishes and generational posture. I told the twins they could bring their crayons. I chose a dress that would allow me to run if necessary. I made a list of phrases I might say if asked to speak, not long but clear. This is what happened. This is what I stopped doing. Here is what I'm doing now. The night before, Aunt Eleanor brought tea and more notes. He's taken the folder to show a few people he trusts first, she said. He wants them to understand before more people arrive. She touched my arm with tenderness that made my eyes sting. We agreed that I would go. I'm not the kind of person who likes public explosions. I had no desire to humiliate anyone, but I also knew the power of seeing numbers laid out in a way that could not be easily reduced to emotion. There is a kind of moral grammar in evidence. It speaks to people who otherwise prefer not to ask hard questions. I slept badly that night, listening to the twins breathe. When morning came, there was a thin, bright cold that made the air feel like the space after a confession, clean and exposing. I dressed the kids and packed an overnight bag, just in case. Grandpa Thomas texted, "Be there at 7, come early, wear something comfortable." As I slid the stroller out of the elevator, the folder heavy in my hand, I realized this was the moment the story tilted. The past 8 years, and the ambulance and the single blunt sentence in the group chat had been moving toward a fulcrum. I wasn't sure whether the fulcrum would lift me or topple something else, but I knew that by walking into the room with evidence, I was asking for the chance to be seen. If you've ever had to set a boundary with family, if you've ever turned inward and realized the quiet labor you gave away was more than you could afford, type truce in the comments. I don't mean to make anyone's life harder. I only want to hear if you too have felt like your love was being counted as an obligation. I pushed open the front door to the house where Grandpa was having his party. People were already gathering in clusters, the kind of small talk that sloshes around the edges of anything real. The smell of roast and coffee filled the air, paper plates and a small line of desserts on the kitchen counter. Vanessa was there, cheeks flushed with the pretense of celebration, laughing too loudly at something someone else had said. My parents were at the opposite end of the room, like actors close to the wings, steady and maybe uneasy. Grandpa Thomas had a slight, almost mischievous smile when he saw me, and he nodded toward the living room where a few chairs were arranged in a semicircle. He gestured for me to sit, and then stood with a calm that suggested he had rehearsed nothing and yet everything. He cleared his throat and said, "Family is complicated. We are gathered to celebrate a life lived by one of our own. But sometimes celebration is a good time to speak plainly." He cupped the folder in one hand and lifted it just enough that a small group shifted, curiosity, not malice. He began to read, not with heat, but with the kind of steady cadence judges use when they want to be heard without theatrics. First he read numbers, simple, undeniable, the transfers, the dates, the running totals. Then he read the message that had arrived that night in the ambulance, a nuisance and a burden, and he said each word slowly like a bell that could not be unstruck. The room changed as if someone had turned the lights down, and all the faces came into sharper focus. People leaned in. Vanessa's laugh faded. My parents' smiles thinned. The reaction was not instantaneous revenge or an all-consuming scandal. It was, rather, the slow, painful flip of awareness, the moment when something previously shrugged off as personal foible becomes public fact. Eyes traveled. A few people closed their mouths against defenses that were ready at the edge. Aunt Eleanor's hand found mine under the chair. Grandpa held the floor like a man who knew that truth, once laid bare, often needs only time and witness to make its work. I sat there holding the folder that had been the hinge of weeks of quiet strategy, heart beat loud in my ears, and thought, this is what truth looks like when presented gently and firmly. It is not a weapon, it is a mirror. When he finished reading, the room filled with a new kind of silence, the not empty silence that asks questions. My parents' faces had shifted into something I could not name, a mix of shame and fury and confusion, all playing like shadows. Vanessa stood close by, suddenly very small for someone who had always seemed to take up so much space. I felt something loosen in my chest, not triumphant but relieved. The facts were out there. The ledger showed clearly where my resources had gone and how my generosity had been taken for granted. I did not crave punishment. I wanted recognition. I wanted my kids' future to be secure in a way my parents' comforts had once been. I wanted the truth to be available to everyone so that choices could be made anew. That night at the party, reactions spread like ripples. A cousin's whisper here, a neighbor's raised eyebrow there. Some people left the room without comment. Others stayed to ask questions. Grandpa Thomas put the folder back on the table and said softly, I wanted people to hear this from someone other than Myra, not to shame, but to show the reality. I watched my parents, watched Vanessa, watched the family rearrange itself in the space between what had been and what was now visible. There was no cataclysm in that moment, only the beginning of a reckoning, the kind that might in time lead to apologies or at least an attempt to repair. I didn't know what would come next. I knew only that I had brought the ledger into the room and that for the first time in a long time, the facts were not mine alone to carry. I left the party that night with the twins asleep in the stroller and a quiet in my chest that felt close to peace. The folder remained under Grandpa's care. I had done what I could. I had stopped the transfers, I had redirected the resources to build a future for my children, and I had let truth be heard in a room full of witnesses. The consequences were unknown, social, financial, relational, but at least they would now be based on what had actually happened, not on the stories people told themselves to avoid feeling uncomfortable. The next morning, coffee in hand, and the faint echo of the party still in my ears, Aunt Eleanor called with a voice that was both relieved and cautious. "People are talking," she said. "Some are angry, some are quiet. Thomas wants to see you tomorrow." Her words carried the sense of a tide that had turned just enough to reach the shore. I knew then that the fallout would not be simple, that ties would be tested, and some might fray. I also knew that having witnesses mattered more than I had realized. There were messages I did not open that night, some from my parents, some from Vanessa. I let them sit. The twins crawled into my lap and tugged at my sleeve, needing cuddles and story time, perfectly uninterested in the adult calculations that had just unfurled in a living room full of people. They are the reason I reallocated the money. They are the reason I am telling this story. I was not immune to the pain of watching people I loved squirm under the weight of what they'd done or failed to do. The goal was never to take pleasure in their discomfort. It was to draw a clean line between what I would continue to carry and what I could not. I had learned a painful lesson. Love that expects sacrifice without reciprocity will eventually hollow you out. The week after the party, there were small, tangible shifts. A cousin who had been distant offered to help with daycare occasionally. Marcus checked in more frequently, not just about my health, but about how I was managing the twins' routine. Grandpa Thomas kept his word and stayed close, his presence like an anchor for a boat in a newly rough sea. I cannot say decisions will be easy for everyone to accept. People will react in ways that are defensive, in ways that are sorrowful, and in ways that are surprisingly supportive. You do not control the fallout, you control your choices. For me, the main choice was to stop giving from a place of depletion and start giving from a place of abundance built for my family's future. There are parts of the story that still ache. There are conversations not yet had. There are apologies that might not come. But there is also the simple, unarguable fact that I am alive, my children are safe, and I am moving forward with intention. When I look at the scar across my abdomen, I remember the ambulance lights, the sound of the siren, the small dark phrase on a screen that changed how I saw things. I remember being a mother in crisis and being treated like a problem. I remember the ledger, the folder, and the measured voice of a man who knew how to present facts without malice. I remember the relief, not vindication, that comes when truth is allowed into a room. The year that followed was not quick. In the months after Grandpa's birthday, things shifted in ways that sometimes wounded and sometimes repaired. Some family members called with tentative apologies, others disappeared into the routines that once sustained them. My parents, Helen and Richard, began in fits and starts to face questions they had long avoided. Vanessa reached out more than once, sometimes clumsy and sometimes earnest, and Grandpa, steady as ever, continued to be a presence. But the part where everything changes all at once, that was not how my life was rewritten. Change, when it is honest, tends to be slow and bewildering, like the first green shoot in a long winter. The difference for me was that the shoot had been planted with intention. I had redirected funds into a college account for Lily and Lucas. I had set up a modest emergency savings that would keep us from ever depending on hurried favors again. And I had built a network of people who would not measure my worth by how much I gave. There is a moral in all of this, one that tastes like both salt and relief. Boundaries are not betrayal. Choosing to protect your future and your children is not the same as choosing to be unloving. It is, instead, an act of stewardship. At the same time, I learned that exposure, showing the ledger, letting people see the truth, can change the conversation in ways gentle words sometimes cannot. Evidence, presented calmly and with witnesses, has a way of making people look at themselves. Whether that produces repentance or resentment depends on the person. But the first step is being brave enough to stop being the only one holding the papers. In the weeks ahead, I still had to make decisions about contact and how to move forward with my parents. I had to decide whether reconciliation was possible, what it would look like, and whether I could trust it. I had to manage the twins' needs and my residency schedule and the small, ordinary rhythms that constitute a life. Grandpa Thomas said to me once, as we walked through a park with the twins chasing pigeons, "We are not responsible for other people's choices. We are responsible for how we respond." His words were not a lecture. They were a quiet hand on my shoulder. They reminded me that the choice to set boundaries was less about punishment and more about survival and dignity. As I watched Lily topple in the grass and Lucas pick herself up and run again, I thought of the years of transfers and the way kindness had been mistaken for a blank check. I thought of the ambulance, the cold antiseptic light, and the family message that had become a turning point. I felt a steady, patient resolve settle in me. The kind that comes after trauma when you decide you will no longer conflate love with obligation. There were more conversations to be had, more reckonings that would ripple outward. There would be difficult moments when my parents would approach me and say things that needed forgiving, or not. There would be phone calls from relatives who took sides and others who tried to bridge. But there was also a slow unrolling of consequence that felt oddly necessary. Truth had been placed on the table, and once people had seen the paper trail and heard the exact words that were sent the night my life hung in the balance, the way the family arranged itself began to change. In the weeks after the birthday, the house became a different kind of stage. Conversations that had once been side comments at holiday dinners were now pointed and cautious. Some relatives crossed rooms to speak quietly with Grandpa Thomas. Others sidestepped him as if that made what they had seen less visible. There was no dramatic scene of people demanding that my parents leave, no televised confrontation. Instead, there was a series of small withdrawals, invitations not sent, casual weekends that no longer included them, neighbors who had once loaned tools now saying the house smelled of an abrupt loss of social momentum. My parents, Helen and Richard, reacted in ways I had been trying not to predict. They moved between confusion and defensiveness, then to a guarded, brittle quiet. I received a few messages I did not open, and a voicemail that began with, "Myra, can we talk?" and then dissolved into sounds that might have been tears or irritation. I couldn't tell. Vanessa texted more than once in the months that followed. Sometimes she said things that felt like attempts to bridge the distance, tentative, clumsy. But sometimes her words retreated back into the safer territory of support for the kids without addressing the ledger itself. There were real consequences. The financial cushion that had sustained my parents for years started to fray. Without the steady deposits that had quietly kept certain monthly obligations from becoming crises, bills came due in ways that felt new and awkward for them. I do not say this to gloat. I say it because the pattern we had lived inside for a decade had relied on a set of assumptions that no longer held. People who had learned to count on a safety net found the net altered. In practical terms, that meant the house, which had been a comfort, a place of longevity, was put on the market a few months later. The sale was a kind of punctuation, part consequence, part recalibration. Relatives whispered at family gatherings that the sale was inevitable now that the finances had been visible. Other relatives, ones who had once been distant, wrote to me privately with offers of help for the twins, or with stories of their own similar reckonings. Vanessa's response settled into a complicated middle ground. She never offered the kind of sweeping apology I sometimes imagined while I sat up worrying at night. What she did offer, over time, were fragmentary attempts to be present. She texted photos of the twins, occasionally dropped off a takeout container she thought they would like, and once, 6 months after Grandpa's party, she called and asked if she could take Lily to a children's theater matinee. Her voice on the phone trembled in a way that made me think she had practiced the words. She said, "I'm sorry for how things went that night. I didn't understand." That phrase, halting as it was, carried something. It was not absolution, it was the start of a different conversation. For a while I let the gestures be what they were, small, imperfect, but real enough to be noticed. The social ripple was broader than our immediate circle. Some family members pivoted to being allies in small but meaningful ways. A cousin who had once been an occasional visitor started coming by with offers to babysit, not eager to be thanked, but because the help felt right. Aunt Eleanor became more than someone who brought casseroles. She became a kind of operational heart, organizing notes, scheduling doctor's visits when my shifts were long, checking in with a steadiness that made crises manageable. Marcos, whose presence at the ambulance felt like survival in the moment, continued to show up in practical ways, picking up shifts when mine clashed with pediatric appointments, double-checking that I had transportation after long nights. Grandpa Thomas kept the folder, but he also kept visiting. He would come by with a trivial newspaper clipping he thought might amuse the twins, or with a crossword puzzle he wanted my help on. His involvement had never been about theatricality. It was about witness and, in his own way, insistence that facts be allowed to inform behavior. I want to be clear about something that felt important in that slow aftermath. The change was not instantaneous, and not everyone moved toward repairing what had been frayed. Some connections softened and then shifted into a polite distance. Other ties gradually mended into a new shape. There were times when my sadness for what had been lost surprised me more than my anger. Grief showed up in the odd hours, waking at 2 a.m., thinking of a voicemail left unreturned, or an image of my parents sitting silently in the corner of a family event, as if they were strangers. But there were also moments of unexpected relief. A Sunday afternoon, when no one asked me to cover a bill I had already been paying for 10 years. A quiet morning where I could choose to spend money on an extra daycare session rather than smoothing the edges of someone else's budget. With the transfers stopped, my financial life had a kind of redirection that felt almost architectural. I took the mental energy I had been investing in other people's household stability and put it into a plan for my children. I opened a college fund in Lily and Lucas's names, modest at first, but steady, and something that would grow in a way that directly benefited them. I set up a small emergency account so that the nightmare of needing to call a stranger at midnight would be less likely to return. These were practical moves, yes, but they felt like reclamation. For the first time in a long time, I was making choices that were primarily about the future of my little family, rather than the preservation of an older home. Moving to a smaller, more manageable apartment closer to the hospital was part logistics and part symbolism. I did not need a big house with multiple bedrooms and a yard to maintain. I needed a home that allowed me to sleep between shifts, to walk to work in 15 minutes, to be available to the twins, and know that when life got chaotic, I could manage it. We found a place with sunlight in the mornings and a laundromat across the street, and the price was right for the stage of life we were in. It was modest. It was not glamorous, but it was ours. The emotional work of all this, of canceling automatic transfers, of walking through the party where the folder was opened, of watching my parents face the consequences, was not something a spreadsheet could fully account for. I had to reckon with the guilt that came up unexpectedly. There are mornings when I still catch myself replaying the night of the accident and wondering if there was something I could have done differently. But the important difference now was that the decisions I made after that night were mine, and I made them with intention for my children. People asked me, with varying degrees of curiosity and sympathy, if I regretted the decision to make the truth public in that way. My answer has never been simple. There are moments when I wish things could have been resolved more privately, when I imagine a conversation where my parents sat across from me and listened without defensiveness. But I also know that the ledger, those bank transfers laid out month by month, acted like a mirror for people who might otherwise have continued to tell themselves kinder stories. When you present numbers and a context and an incontrovertible message from a phone at a critical moment, the conversation changes. Some people needed that clarity to stop excusing what had been happening. Others recoiled from it. Both reactions were a kind of truth. The months that followed involved recalibrations on both sides. My parents had to adapt to new budgeting realities and to the social consequences of being publicly shown the pattern of my support. They made decisions, some I did not agree with, others that seemed to be honest attempts to reorient. At one point their house went on the market. They moved out a few months later. I learned about the sale through family grapevine, messages from relatives who had been watching unfold, some sympathetic to me, some sorry for the way things had unraveled. I felt compassion for the disorientation they must have felt as their routines were disrupted. That compassion did not erase the fact that for years my giving had been taken for granted, but it did make room for a more complex picture of responsibility. Vanessa and I had conversations that were fitful and sometimes constructive. She has her own life, her own pressures, and looking back I can see she was not always willing or able to see how much I had absorbed to keep things afloat. When she offered small apologies or asked to build a bridge, I accepted those gestures for what they were, openings. I did not demand immediate repentance or full accounting from her. I wanted to see pattern changes more than performative remorse. Over time, she showed up in ways I did not expect. A holiday visit that did not feel performative, a call to ask how school enrollment for the twins was going. Those were not big acts that erased years, but they were signs that relationships can be complicated knits of history, and sometimes threads can be rewoven if both parties are willing. Community support, too, surprised me in its quiet endurance. Friends from residency brought casseroles when my schedule made dinner impossible. Neighbors babysat when Aunt Eleanor was out of town. People I had never met in person, viewers of a short post I made about boundaries on a private page, sent messages of solidarity that helped shore up my resolve on hard nights. I tried not to let that attention become another obligation. Instead, I treated it as a reminder that the world is broader than the family we are born into, that kinship can be chosen and cultivated. I learned to accept help in small, practical forms, which for me was a meaningful part of healing. Marcus, Aunt Eleanor, Grandpa Thomas, and a handful of cousins formed an ad hoc network that made day-to-day life possible during transitions. There is dignity in asking for childcare when you are a medical resident working the odd hours. Pulling a double shift is not always heroic if you do not have a village to come home to. Sometimes the help came as someone holding a bored toddler while I signed paperwork. Sometimes it was a text that said simply, "You're not alone." Therapy entered the picture, slowly and privately. I began to meet with someone who helped me sort grief from anger and helped me reframe the story I had been telling myself. It was important to learn the language of boundaries without guilt, to say no in ways that did not feel like betrayal. The work was not glamorous. It was the daily practice of setting limits and then checking in with myself to see if those limits were healthy or reactionary. I learned to name the difference. One of the more surprising outcomes was the slow, complicated shift in some relatives who had initially been skeptical of my choices. Seeing the folder and hearing the facts helped a few people understand that my long-term giving had been less an act of charity than a structural support that had allowed certain habits to continue. When they realized that, they began to voice support in ways practical and moral, checking in, offering to host a weekend at their house so the twins could have a break, or simply acknowledging in a message that they had misread how much I was carrying. Those small confessions mattered because they meant I was no longer the only one narrating the truth of what had happened. It's worth saying again that I did not wish ruin on my parents. Watching them navigate the aftermath sometimes felt heartbreaking. The aim was not revenge. The aim was truth and the safety of my children. When decisions are made from a place of depletion, the result is often a slow erosive of one's own life. Drawing a line does not mean you don't still care. It means you are choosing to love in ways that do not erase your future. For me, that meant redirecting resources into the twins' college fund and into an emergency buffer so that our family wouldn't once again be at the mercy of a system that assumed I would always pick up the slack. There were practical reorganizations I had to manage that felt boring and enormous all at once. Changing automatic beneficiaries on accounts, scheduling a consistent childcare arrangement, recalibrating my own budget to reflect a new baseline of security. These tasks felt less like punishments and more like the work of building a life intentionally. When the twins started preschool, I could breathe, not because the work was over, but because the scaffolding I had set in place meant I no longer had to make choices out of fear. Months turned into a year. The scar across my abdomen faded from a deep purple to a pale line that I catch myself tracing sometimes when I need to remember where I was and how far I have come. The memory of the ambulance siren is still vivid. The sting of a phrase on my screen, a nuisance and a burden, still flares in certain contexts. But those moments are bookended now by other images. Lily and Lucas making a mess at the breakfast table and laughing, Grandpa Thomas reading them a clumsy joke and watching them giggle, Aunt Eleanor teaching Lucas to tie his shoes in a patient, repetitive way. People sometimes ask me if I've forgiven my parents. Forgiveness is a private, complicated thing. I cannot give a neat, single-sentence answer. What I can say is that I have stopped carrying the ledger alone. I have stopped allowing my generosity to be a substitute for recognition. I made choices that prioritized my children's future and my own health. That did not come without cost. There has been loss, but there has also been gain. What I hope anyone hearing this understands, whether you are a single parent, someone who has spent years quietly giving, or a listener trying to make sense of what a healthy family looks like, is that boundaries are acts of preservation, not betrayal. Saying no to patterns that hollow you out is not evidence you are unloving. Often it is evidence you are learning what love must look like if it is to endure. The fulcrum in this story was not merely the moment of revelation at a birthday party or the indignity of a text message sent when I needed help most. The fulcrum was the courage to name an 8-year pattern and to refuse to be the only person responsible for the family's seams. It was the willingness to let facts be witness so conversations could change. It was the reallocation of resources into things that would actually outlive me and serve the most vulnerable people I love, my children. As for my parents, the future remains unsettled. They live differently now. They make different choices. Whether full reconciliation is possible someday is something I cannot predict. What I do know is that I'm alive and present for the small, relentless work of parenting toddler twins while finishing residency. That presence is the best answer I could have given to a life that once assumed my sacrifice was unlimited. If any part of this resonates with you, if you've ever felt like your love was being counted as an obligation, know you are not alone. Naming a boundary is often the first step towards securing a future you can live in with your head held up. It will not always be comfortable. It will ask you to bear witness to things you may have preferred to ignore. But there is a kind of peace that arrives when you stop being the only one who knows the full cost of your giving. Thank you for listening to my story. If this resonated with you, please subscribe for more real-life stories about setting boundaries and finding strength. And if you feel led, share this with someone who needs to hear they are not alone.